Record to cloud. There we go. We're on.
Okay. Welcome to WP-Tonic, episode 182. And today, our main topic, we're going to be talking working with a designer or a developer, both sides of the table. But before we get into today's topic, I want to give a big thanks to our sponsor, Liquid Web. While Liquid Web's best been known as a managed hosting company with tons of options, recently they've designed a managed WordPress offering that's perfect for mission-critical sites. So if you're looking for improved performance, maximized uptime, and incredible support, Liquid Web is the hosting partner you've been looking for. Now, every Liquid Web managed WordPress customer also has iTheme Sync integrated right into their management portal, allowing them to update several sites with a single touch. So if you sign up today using the discount code WP-Tonic33, you'll get 33% off the next 6 months of your hosting. Visit liquidweb.com/WordPress today to get started and use that code WP-Tonic33. And with that, we're going to let the panel introduce themselves. So we're going to start with our guest, Nick. Nick, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, where you're from.
I'm from Dallas, Texas. I am the lead developer at a company called Primer Co., which is just a web design and development agency.
Excellent. And then also in the house, we've got our esteemed guest, Morten.
Hey, I'm a senior staff instructor at LinkedIn Learning and have opinions.
Yes, you do. And then we've got our longtime panelist, a great dear friend of the show, Kim.
Hi, I'm Kim Schivler. I'm a teacher, speaker, teaching business and technology.
And then my beloved co-host, Jonathan.
Oh, hi there, folks. I'm the founder of WP-Tonic. We're a maintenance security support company. We only deal with WordPress. We're your trusted partner, aren't we, John?
Definitely. And I'm John Locke. My business is Lockdown Design, providing custom WordPress development and local SEO for blue-collar businesses. Before we head into our main topic, we've got 2 WordPress news stories. And the first of them is written by our guest, Morten, the end of the 80-20 and the future of WordPress. Morten, take it away. Break it down what you're talking about here.
Right. So, you know that guy, Matt?
Yeah, I've heard of him.
Yes.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
Sometimes he says stuff in comment sections on blogs, and you go, wait, what? What did you just say? And that happened on Friday. So on Friday, Matt, in a comment section about in a WP Tavern article about the uproar over the redesign of the plugin directory on WordPress.org, there was some discussion in the comments about how when the redesign happened, the development team and the design team kept saying, we're going to do this with user-centric design, and we're going to, test this on actual user before we do anything. And then there were a bunch of people that gave feedback, none of which was listened to. And then the original design got published into the system. And then Matt responded by saying, quote, it might be time to retire 80-20 from the philosophy page, as it's seldom used as intended. Now, for those who don't know what 80-20 is, on the WordPress philosophy page, so the philosophy page for how WordPress is developed, it says, let's see, I have to find it here. The rule of thumb is that the core should provide features that 80% or more of end users will actually appreciate and use. If the next version of WordPress comes with a feature that the majority of users immediately want to turn off or think they'll never use, we've blown it. If we stick to the 80% principle, then that should never happen. The 80-20 principle is this weird principle that's used in business in different ways. And the way WordPress uses it, like this particular interpretation of it, is actually kind of unusual. But the sentiment behind it is really important and quite valid, that if you're building something for a mass of users, you should really try to build solutions that work for the majority of those users, and don't add in things that are not used by the majority. Now, in the case of WordPress, there are many, many, many situations where the argument has risen that a feature that's included or a feature that's excluded or something like that, or a design decision that's made is not made in consideration of the 80% of users or even the 20% of users, but more like the 1% or the 1% of the 1% of users, because WordPress is developed by the people who develop WordPress. And they're open source contributors who tend to just develop things that they need right now. An example of that would be something like the video playlist feature inside WordPress. I don't know if anyone uses that feature, but it's in core. And not only is it in core, but if you want to use it, you have to hack it to get it to work with anything other than a very, very narrow use case. Another thing is how post formats got included. The reason why post formats UI never got through was because Matt literally shut down the project when he realized the lack of user testing resulted in a solution people didn't understand. And when they did some very low level user testing, they realized if we ship this, people will stop using WordPress because it's too confusing. So in my article, I'm asking a question. I'm not posing a solution. I'm simply asking a question. What is the philosophy that we want to run running forward? Because right now in the philosophy page, it says we're designing for the 80%. The reality is we don't have any numbers or information or any project in the works to get that information. So we can't say that we're designing for the 80% because no one knows what the 80% is. We have no way of testing things against the 80%. It's basically just words that don't have any meaning. On the other hand, if we retire the 80-20% principle and just say, no, we're just going to design for the people who contribute, that is a very strong statement that we're designing for the contributors, not for the end users. And no matter how much the contributors might say, no, we're designing for the users, the reality is you're not, because you can't design for the users if you don't know what the users are doing. And right now we don't. So this comment by Matt, combined with a bunch of other things he said and a bunch of other things other people have said, just brought to a head this thing that's been going on for a long time. And I just wanted to crystallize it so people understand there are two ways of going forward here, and we have to actively make a choice. We can't just pretend that one thing is happening when it's not, or just push it down. So at the end, I mentioned my telemetry proposal, which is the proposal to simply get WordPress to gather telemetry on how it's used. This is what's done with pretty much all other software, just to get some use data. We've talked about that here before, I believe. And the telemetry proposal was shut down by Matt. And every time I bring it up, he keeps saying, no, we're not going to do that. And there's a huge movement in the WordPress community, including core developers, who really want telemetry. So I don't know why it's like, I haven't heard a reason why it's been shut down other than it's not a priority right now. I would like to hear a reason why. There might be a totally legitimate reason. It might be competition. It might be some strategic decision-making. It might be simply we don't want to design for the end user, because the end user, if we just take the full mass of WordPress, the majority user is actually not the target audience we want. But that has to be explicitly stated. We can't pretend we're doing one thing and doing something else. Okay, and rant.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I agree with this. I don't understand why there's such an opposition by Matt to telemetry. I don't think it would hurt anything. I don't think it would be that hard to implement, but it's obviously something that they're opposed to. We don't know the reasons why. But just like even in our last episode, we were talking to Jonathan Courtney, who does UX for global brands, and the thing of it is if you try and design stuff like out of your head, like with user personas and all these things, it might not line up with the real users, how they actually use the product or what they actually do. And it would be good to have that information, considering 27% of the web is now being powered by WordPress. I think if you want to grow it, bigger, it would be good to, see how the users actually use the product, WordPress. Nick, any thoughts on this?
No, I think we definitely should be testing for the end user. I don't understand why you would be shutting that down in general. I mean, I think it would be a good thing to be doing that. So, I mean, I really don't understand the reasoning behind that at all. So,
just to be clear, no one explicitly says that. I'm just
Yeah.
saying the lack of any kind of discussion about it makes that implied.
right. No, I totally get what you're saying.
Kim, thoughts?
Absolutely agreed. It was a great article, Morten. I really enjoyed that article. I absolutely agree. And of course, my customer base is the end user. I don't work with developers. Other than when I work with developers, it's developers who need to understand the business use case of building a platform for the end user. But my customers are the end user. And so I agree with the telemetry, and I really think if WordPress wants to keep growing, we've got to focus on those end users. It's big enough now that, my background in corporate, like when I was part of an IBM team, we had product managers and they went to the customer and they worked with the customer, brought it back to development. And WordPress is kind of at that growing pain point. I think they, to go to the next level, have to bring something, doesn't have to be that formal, but something like that in where we understand the end user, the customer's problem, and build a solution that we make sure is addressing that.
I mean, I teach a class at a polytechnic here in town, and I've been brought in specifically to teach user-centered design, and I make them go through this huge process, right, of figuring out who the target audience is, and then figuring out what their goals and needs and hindrances and everything is, and then going out and interviewing them, and then making a strategy and making personas and making all these things, right? And this is how it's done. Like, this is how you design products for real people, is you go out and talk to those people, because you're not those people. You know way too much about the technology to be those people. And when I ask questions like, who is the target audience for this new feature? Or do we have a persona that we're designing towards? The answer is always, no, you're distracting from what we're talking about here. We're trying to make it work. So the focus is very much on, I have a great idea. Let's put tons of resources into building that idea. And it's in a user-centered design approach, that's the end part of the process. And my concern is, if we keep going the way we're doing now, there's a good chance that we'll keep running into the same situation we had with the Pulse Formats UI. Just instead of it being pulled by Matt, it'll be included into the application. So basically what will happen is a ton of work will be done on some sort of feature that developers think is needed, and they'll have 100% valid reasons for thinking so. It's done with the intent of improving WordPress, but because there's no data to prove that it actually makes sense for the end user, you might end up in a situation where you build something that makes sense for a small group, but actually hinders the majority of users or confuses them in some way. And if a lot of work is done on that project without any user testing, it'll be very hard to pull at the end, because there's such a heavy investment from volunteers in building it that it's very hard to say, actually, all that work you did, we need to scrap it because it doesn't work. An example of that right now is the Gutenberg editor project that's happening. So they're going to redesign the entire WordPress editor. The level, like the quality of the Gutenberg editor prototype, in my opinion, is way too high. There's way too much work being done on making the prototype perfect before it's been tested against real users. So what will likely happen is, once it gets put in front of users, it'll be very hard for the development team if they get feedback that says, actually, we don't understand this, because there's such an enormous investment in the development and the design of that thing, that anything that comes back and says it doesn't work, you'll encounter this cognitive dissonance where you go, well, the reason why you can't figure it out is because you don't know enough, or because it's not clear, or because you don't see it in context, or because you haven't used it enough, rather than saying, maybe this wasn't the problem that needed to be fixed, or maybe we approached it the wrong way, or maybe we should have, added other features to it. None of that exists right now. And it's not even criticism of the team, it's criticism of the process, that our development process in WordPress is not user-centered. And it's established itself now to such an extent that when you bring up user-centered processes, people will actively fight you on doing that because they say, we don't need to do that much research. It takes too much time. It takes too many resources, or volunteers won't do it because it's too, that's not what they want to work on, or we don't have the money for it or the time or something like that. And it's just not responsible. When we ship stuff for WordPress, we're shipping it to millions of users. We have a duty of care to make sure that those users get what they need and that we don't break their personal blogs or their businesses or anything else by introducing interactions that don't make any sense to them.
Here's an idea that just occurred to me, like when you were saying all this, is if this was not an open source project, would the design process be being run this way at all? No, I don't think so.
No, because people would be paid. So some boss at the top could say, actually, you team over here, you're responsible for doing research on this. And then they'll be like, I don't want to do this. And then he'll be like, well, that's fine. I can just not pay you. And then other people will come and do that job for you, right? The problem here is either we need to bring in contributors who actually want to do user research, or we have to establish a process that says before we do anything, you have to prove it. You have to prove this idea that it makes sense to the end user. Even if that takes a ton of time, you have to do it because that's the responsible thing to do.
No, well said. Our other news story today.
Can I say something?
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. Don't let me run you over. Go ahead.
Well, I agree with a lot of Morten said. Obviously, getting data, you think that would be a non-brainer, and you would be, unless there was some strong argument why that wouldn't be a good thing to do, you would be puzzled. When it comes to rapid design, really, Morten, you really should listen to the last episode of WP-Tonic with Jonathan Courtney. And I think you would find it really interesting, because I think some of the processes around the design process that you've outlined are really totally contradicted by Jonathan. The other thing, I'm going to be the devil's advocate here. Also, folks, you should go to episode 169 and listen to our interview with AJ Morrison and Chris Lemmer. And Chris strongly pointed out to me, Morten, that this is a benign dictatorship we're dealing with here, and if you don't want to be in the playground, you don't have to be there. And Chris basically, and I think John would agree with that, strongly pointed that in the way that he could only do, could he, John?
Yeah, definitely. And I was thinking about that too. That same thing, saying like if you don't want to be in the ecosystem and if you don't want to accept the rules, then find another ecosystem or do your own thing. But in a way, I think that a lot of people are sometimes penalized, not just in WordPress, but like in many different environments, workplaces, or different things. When you care too much about something and you try and change it for the better, sometimes you're actually slapped down and penalized, but I do think that this needs to be done, because it can't just be on a whim of whatever the developers want to do or the contributors want to do, but that's basically who makes things go forward in WordPress. But
it's Matt.
Hold on. What are you talking about? First of all, benevolent dictatorship is nonsense. There are tons of examples in WordPress of Matt saying, we're not doing this, and it happening anyway, right? And Matt is not a dictator. He's more like a safety valve. When things go totally off the chain, then he's like, stop. This is not working, right? The idea that this is a benevolent dictatorship is a very dangerous one, because it provides cushion for people to say, well, we can't change, because no, that's not how this works at all, right? This is the people who develop WordPress are the people that are in charge of WordPress. Anytime we say there's a benevolent dictatorship, we're just building up this ridiculous notion that there is. It's not. I'm sorry. The other thing is the idea that if we say, well, if you don't want to play if you don't want to play by the rules, then get out. You can't say that, because there are millions and millions of people who use WordPress every day who don't have a say. They just use it because they've been told it's the best platform. To say that they then have to submit to some sort of rule set that is changed arbitrarily or not followed is not responsible. It's crazy. That's the whole point, that you can't say, we follow the 80-20 rule, then you don't follow the 80-20 rule. Then at some point people go, actually, no, we don't follow this. We're just going to scrap it. All the while, millions of people around the world use the platform thinking, I'm safe using WordPress. WordPress will have my back at all times. Those are the people we need to care about. Those people don't care who's in charge. They just want to make sure the platform works for them, and they're screwed if we start messing with it without understanding what they use it for. So yeah, sure. On a high level, I am an integrated developer that always works in WordPress. These discussions are interesting, and we can say, oh, you need to submit to whatever rule is there, and da-da-da-da. In reality, though, we are building for people who are not part of this community, who will never be part of this community, who just used a tool. The attitude really is either follow the rules or get out, then we need to explicitly say that. This platform was developed for the people who build it. If you choose to use it, that is your responsibility and your risk to take. That's not how we sell WordPress. That's not how we should sell WordPress. That's not how WordPress works. Seriously. See, I have opinions.
Thoughts?
I think he's Morten arrogantly. I was just being the devil's advocate anyway, John. So, should we go to our
main topic? Yeah.
Go for our break and then go for the main topic, John.
Okay. Sounds great. When we come back, we're going to be talking with our WordPress panel about our main topic, which is both sides of the aisle. If you're a designer, how do you work with a developer? If you're a developer, how do you work with a designer? And we'll be talking that when we come back after the commercial break. We're coming back from the break, and now we're into our main topic, working with a designer or developer. I want to ask Nick, you work in a small agency, you're a developer, you work with a designer. When you, in the days before you guys formed this agency, did you work with other designers, and how was that relationship, and how did you guys form a process now to where you guys work in cohesion?
So in the early days, when we were using Photoshop, and when I first got into all this, I was working at an internship at it was still a small company. It was about 8 to 10 people in Southlake, and it was all virtual. So any designers that I'd be working with, I didn't really have a lot of communication with, other than just delivery, which did make some things difficult, just because I'd be getting, different, very unorganized files from some people, and stuff that was it would add time to my plate just based on who I was working with. So throughout that process of working with people like that, and then moving on to my next job, where I'd be actually working hand in hand with somebody, where I could discuss, hey, this is what I would prefer, the way you're designing is, to adding more time to my plate and stuff like that. You really just got to get into the flow with somebody, I guess, and just because I guess everybody works differently. So I've gotten into a good flow with Hunter, which is our lead designer at Primer, and everything we do is rapid now, just because now we switched over from Photoshop to Sketch, which has made life a lot easier. And we've just got a really good flow down with, him just delivering sketch files. Our process is just wireframing. So before, when we initially started, we didn't do any wireframing at all. We would just design it, get it approved, I would build it. Now our process is transformed into, we kind of get a rough design sketch going. He builds a high fidelity wireframe and sketch. I'll build that. And then as I'm building that, he'll also get into his design process. So basically it just expedites the entire process, because I'll basically have the entire layout built by the time he actually delivers the design. So flow like that has helped us a lot from getting the ball rolling, especially from the early days when it was taking us, 2 months to get a design built out. So.
One thing that I want to ask you too, like when you're kind of building out the designs, do you guys have a lot of discussion about what each thing means, like in the design as far as the functionality? Like, like say you have like a thing like, what does this actually do?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. So we have like, before we even like get into the actual design process of him even laying out the page, we'll just kind of discuss, what elements are going to be on the page. Why are they going to be on the page? Kind of talk to the client and see what their expectations are from that, and then give recommendations from there. But yeah, no, every time we do anything like that, we always ask, why, and basically just dumb it down to the simplest level, like less is more always. So like, we always try to like, if there's absolutely no reason to, have it there, then like, we're just not going to put it there. So we kind of just try to dumb it down to the, the simplest point where the client can still understand what we're trying to do. But it's just as straightforward as possible at that point.
Kim, I want to ask you, in your experience, like, have you worked with designers or developers, and how do they bridge the gap of speaking different languages? What are your personal experiences with that?
I love what you were saying there with as far as the wireframing and all. I think the issues I have seen are when you don't have some kind of process like that. A lot of times there's a complete breakdown, right? We have developers who are completely into jargon land and they know what they can do. We have designers who build this beautiful idea, and it's kind of like, if you be old school, go back to when I went to college a long time ago, it's kind of like architects and structural engineers, right? The architect would build this beautiful thing and the structural engineers like, that's nice, I can't make it stand up. So it was, always finding and what I do now with corporate teams is helping them find that, getting through the jargon and finding a process. In this case, it's wireframing. In the cases I'm with, it tends to be more of taking the problem solution from customer through, but finding whichever process that is, whatever communication style and adaptations to styles that need to happen in order to make the connection and have a connection that can that can work well. Also, I have to say, in my experiences, most of mine have been much bigger teams. So not just one, you are good at what you do, and you're also obviously good at finding a designer that you guys can connect with and build that process. I, a lot of times, was building with, there's 20 people on this team and there's 20 people on this team, and they're trying to mesh the whole thing. And that was when it really got more confusing, and we will go into full out communication styles, breaking down the jargon, making sure we're understanding it with each person, and then building that process and that gap, or fill the gap.
Something you said that I want to key on just for a second is, breaking down the jargon. Both designers and developers kind of have their own jargon. Like, what are some steps that teams can take to kind of communicate better with each other and understand each other's terminology?
First is to just accept that we have it, right? Understand that just because I say something to someone else, actually this happened to me on a call with one of my coaches the other day. I was talking about a piece of software and I said, that's kludgy as hell. She's not a technical person at all. She's a business coach. Actually, she's my speaking coach. And she's like, what the heck is a kludgy? And I just, sorry, geek speak, software talk. So the first thing is knowing that we have it and starting to dig through what was built around us that say, we don't want to share. We don't like that person. If we come to it as, if we build this together, we're going to give something better to our customer, then we can start putting those together and breaking it down.
Absolutely. Something I want to ask Morten, at Pink and Yellow, and you're kind of like a hybrid, like, designer developer, but when you guys are putting together sites, how did you evolve your process of communicating between designers and developers, and how did that handoff in working together process kind of evolve?
It depends very much on the project. So Pink and Yellow is actually just two people, and it's a producer and me. So our scope is beyond just websites. We do a lot of weird stuff too. So what I often do is bring in outside developers or outside designers to do specific things. Like, so, I design a lot of stuff, but I have a style, and not everyone likes my style. So I'll go out and find other designers who are more in tune with whatever the client wants. In the beginning, I would just say, here's the spec for the thing. I want kind of something, and then the designer would throw stuff back at me, and I would just build it. But over time, I realized that doesn't work. So we started a much more inclusive process where we would work with the clients and then map out exactly what they need, not just what they think they need, but what they actually need, and then do wireframing and user testing on the wireframes and build some very simple prototypes, usually just HTML prototypes or very basic WordPress sites, and then send that to the designer and say, okay, so these are the components that go together. This is how they look in mobile version and other things. And I want you to, build a look to this. And now we've gotten to the point where we start all the way back with mood boards and walk through this quite extensive design process so that by the time the design is done, the development is done as well, because a majority of the design now happens in the browser. We've tried to move away from designing in Photoshop or Illustrator or anything, because that's not where the thing lives. It lives in a browser. So I try to get designers who are competent enough in front end, so CSS, HTML, and maybe some JavaScript, to be able to cobble together what they want it to look like. And then they can hand it to me, and then I can tear it apart and build it to work better and integrate it into WordPress. And clean up the code, but I know exactly what it was the designer intended to do. That's only possible because I've made a very, very strong effort to learn the language of all the parties involved. So I can speak to a UX designer, I can speak to an information architect, I can speak to just a graphic designer and a developer and a backend developer, and augment my language to fit with whatever they want, and know at all times what their goals and needs are, so that the communication, I can basically talk to a designer and then go and talk to a backend developer and communicate what the designer wants in a way the developer understands, by associating what the designer wants with what the developer's goals are, right? That process, I almost think is akin to what happens in hospitals, right? If you go to an emergency room and you have some sort of major emergency where there's, a person that comes in with many types of injuries at the same time, who requires a team of different people to work on, you'll often see there's a human being in the room who's not like scrubbed in, who's standing in the back of the room and yelling at everyone all the time. That's the emergency room communicator that basically says, okay, this team over here does this one thing, this team over here does the other thing. Sometimes they have to coordinate, and then that's the coordinator that's standing in the back and going, okay, so you stop because these other people need to do something, and I know that you want to do this thing, but this is actually more important, and I'm making that decision right now, back off. Or saying, these people keep saying that thing, that means you need to do this other thing, right? So you have this glue that just makes sure the communication happens. And that's probably what we all need to get better at.
I agree. Like, the communication seems to be like the biggest obstacle when designers and developers work together, and that's something we'll talk about in just a second. But right now, I want to ask Jonathan. In your experience, when it comes to communicating, because you coordinate like a lot of stuff. Like, you have different like players that you work with, and when it comes to coordinating like communication between designers and developers, in your experience, what are obstacles or pitfalls that happen, and what are your thoughts on process?
Well, it kind of really varies upon the scale of the project, doesn't it? And I've been thinking about it quite a bit since our last interview with Jonathan. Really, I don't know if you've been thinking about that interview, John, but I did find it quite enlightening about a lot of the processes which the industry kind of holds sacred in a way. And that interview, Jonathan showed me that basically a lot of these processes could be quickened quite considerably by working with the client. If you've got a client who's up for it, you could really develop something much more rapidly in a much more intense sprint. Did that make any sense, John?
Yeah, it totally made sense. Something that I want to share, because I have done like a lot of subcontract work for larger agencies where their specialty might be branding or design. Lots of different people, like on the East Coast, not on the West Coast. I don't know why. Don't ask me. But and they all kind of have a similar language and kind of way that they set up. I've been blessed pretty much because people are usually pretty good about grouping like their Photoshop files or if it's Sketch or if we're doing it in InVision. InVision is actually pretty good, very useful for me. But one thing that I've kind of found is a lot of time as you go deeper into a relationship when you're working with somebody that's more designery and you're more the developer, there is like a lot of questions that come up of like, what is this supposed to do? How, how do you want this to be? Because when you're just looking at a visual representation, you can kind of fill in some of the blanks, but the communication is really imperative. And a lot of times when people are like handing stuff off to you, like as a subcontract, you're not always clued in because they might be talking with the clients. You're not part of that conversation as much. So one thing that I've implemented recently a lot is doing a design handoff call. And I said, like, to all my different people, like, hey, this is just something that we need to do. So like, if I have any questions, they can get answered and that'll just save us time, like in the long run. But another thing, like what we were talking about, like the language the designers have and developers have is so different. And it took me a while to kind of like pick up on some of that stuff, like when people say like right rail, left rail, that's usually like a sidebar, or they'll say like overview page, that's usually like an archive page. It's just how my mind works, like different than that. But moving on, I want to ask the panel, there is a debate that I've seen a lot online in the last few years, and it goes a little something like this. It goes like, should designers learn to code? And because again, it's that attempt for both sides of the aisle to feel like they're being understood. And a lot of times the response is kind of like, well, should developers learn to design? Which I think both should, and both is that. But there seems to have emerged kind of a confrontational attitude of like, you're either in one tribe or the other, and like, whose job is more important. And my question to Nick is, what have you observed about this kind of philosophical question, and what can both sides learn from learning a little bit about what the other side does?
Well, I think it is important at some level to understand both sides of the aisle. I think if you're a designer, I think it's probably more beneficial on the designer's side to learn code, at least a little bit of HTML front end and CSS stuff. Cause like, especially since I've been working with Hunter, like I've been trying to convince him to try and learn front end stuff, not only to help me, but also we can have those conversations where it's like, all right, like, he knows H1 through H6, like he understands that type of stuff. And he did start learning a lot of it. So, and like, as soon as he started understanding the terminology, all the stuff that I was talking about, like, hover states, and like when it really comes down to like the nitty gritty stuff like that, he now understands, like he already knows what questions I'm going to be asking because he understands it at a very high level. And then from my perspective as a developer, like the change from Photoshop when I initially started, which, to me was questionable anyway. I was like, wait, why are we using Photoshop? I had to learn basically how to use Photoshop at that point. And then he was like, wait a minute, we're going to switch over to Sketch. I'm like, oh, okay. What is that? Like, why are we doing that? And from my perspective, I had to understand vector, based design, and why would we be doing that, SVGs and stuff like that. So it all commingles a lot. I think from both sides of the aisle, it's very beneficial to have at least a high level of what's going on when you either receive the design or whenever you pass it on.
No, definitely. Have you found by each you and Hunter, like learning a little bit about each other's stuff, like the whole process is accelerated, like designing stuff is, and getting like it into production, like a working site is much quicker. And
oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. We're able now to bang out a site very fast, just because Sketch, I feel like Sketch has definitely expedited our entire process, just because you could copy a lot of the CSS properties straight from Sketch, which definitely makes my job easier. And then from his perspective, he's now been able, we just did 8 pages yesterday, and I already started, developing those out. So it's like, I think once you get a flow down with the person you're working with, whether that's a subcontractor or whoever you're working with, I think that it's very important to get an understanding of the terminology down, and then just kind of understanding each other's process of, like, now he understands that the whole process of it took some learning to figure out that wireframes and then the design process would work best, because we were like, wait, why do we need to do that? But then we got into that weird time where, like, we would be redesigning the site like 3 times. It's like, wait a minute, that layout's not going to work. And it's like, we already basically have a style guide that we've implemented to the whole site. So we basically have to rework the whole thing. So that process of the wireframing gets approved, me developing it, him design gets approved, I develop that. That has been the quickest way for us to push a site out.
excellent. Kim, where do you fall on this, the debate of how much should developers learn design and how much should designers learn to develop?
I think the high level is important for both of them. I think at the basis, absolutely, like we've said, they need to understand there is a different vocabulary and speak it with each other. So, for example, as you mentioned, he knows his H1s, you have to go into creating it. And I mean, we had this discussion actually a couple of weeks ago. I even take that all the way out, not just to the developer designer discussion, but even with the end user discussion. They may not have to, right? Somebody who just has a blog and someone created it and they're just adding their blog post, they're not going to dig deep into HTML and CSS and PHP, but they still need to understand that overall picture of what's going on in the background, so that they actually even know who to hire when they need something. They need to understand the difference in developing and designing, and how to work with both of those people. So yes, I think at least at the high level, both need to understand how to do the other's work and how to at least communicate that need to whomever they need to communicate. And it comes all the way out to that end user.
No, I think that's great. Morten, when it comes to this debate of should designers learn to code and should coders learn to design, how can this be a productive discussion, and should there be more kind of exploration of things just outside our wheelhouse?
I think the focus specifically on to code is distraction from what we're actually talking about. Not in this conversation here, but in general. There's this whole movement about everyone should know how to code, and that's like the new thing that everyone needs. the act of coding is not what we're really talking about. We're talking about understanding how content is structured and why things why things work and how they fit together. I think anyone who designs, no, let me rewind that. If you learn to become a painter, you don't do all your painting in Photoshop and then you hand it off to someone else to paint it on a canvas, right? If you're a photographer, you don't go to photography school and learn how to draw a picture and then hand it to someone else who takes the picture. If you design stuff for the web, you need to know how to actually make it work on the web. Now, it's really important to understand that does not mean you need to be a front-end developer, because front-end development is taking something in the browser and optimizing it and using perfect code and everything. What I mean is you need to be able to work inside the canvas the thing you're designing will actually live in, which happens to be the web browser. Now, there's a lot of discussion about, can designers learn to code, and, they have the wrong mindset to it, and they're the wrong type of person for coding, and coding is not built for them. My experience is if you introduce coding to a designer in a different way, it's successful 100% of the time, which is to say, bring them in at the content modeling stage. So the content modeling stage is when you say, okay, so here we have these different types of content. We have a page, we have a post, we have a product page, we have whatever. And so in the page, we have a title and the page content and no comments at the bottom. On the post, we have the post title and the categories and the meta content and the content itself. And in the content, you might have all these other things. And then you have the comment section and then related posts and all these things. And then for the product page, you have all the different pieces that go into the project. Into the product. Now, all these things need to be saved separately in the database so that they can be pulled in and used individually. And then they need to be structured in a way on the page so that it's so that they are ordered in a hierarchical way, so that if you just read it from the top, you get the most important information and the second most important and so on down, right? If you say that to a designer, they'll be like, okay, I understand. So, the priority of this thing, because it's on the top and my list needs to be bigger and bolder and everything. And from there, making the analogy, okay, so you want that to be the most important thing. So here we'll put it into a structured document. It's called an HTML document, so that we put the order the way it's supposed to be. Then you can open this little tab in your browser and start messing with the display of that thing and putting a box around it and floating it off to the side and flexing the elements and everything. Once you take a designer into coding like that and show them that everything you're doing in the browser actually has an equivalent in Illustrator or InDesign or whatever it is you're currently using, the only difference is you're typing in the commands instead of explicitly drawing them out. There's this light bulb moment where they go, oh, I actually understand what's going on here. And it's especially true now because we have these modern tools, right? We can do drop shadows and blurs and image filters and rounded corners and even CSS shapes and floating and clearing and flexing and grids and everything. We all have that in the browser. And the browsers even have support tools for it. So once they realize all the things they're used to using exist here, they're just in code format, it becomes much easier for them to work in it. And then you can go back and say to the developer, you know how when the designer says, I want this to happen, and you go, whatever, it's too complicated. There's a reason why they're doing that. And if they're part of that conversation of, we have our structured content, we need to make it look a certain way to bring it forward, the developer understands why the design decisions are made the way they are. Even if they don't necessarily agree with them or even care, they say, I see why you're doing it like this, because you're trying to give this thing preference over this other thing, even though it's halfway down the page. And that gives them a reason to say, oh, so next time we come to a project and say, oh, but why is the price so small here? The last 5 projects I worked on, the designers always made the price large, right? Then they can have that conversation with the designer. So it's a different kind of conversation. You don't want to learn code for the sake of learning code. You want to learn how this platform works and why it works the way it does, and then figure out how to put it together.
A lot of what I'm taking away from your comment is basically like the classical artists learn the materials. Before they could carve like a statue, they had to go and pick a piece of marble.
Mm-hmm.
It's knowing your materials. Kim? Did you have something?
No, I love the way you put that. I thought that was beautifully said.
Jonathan, what can we learn, from learning design as developers, or if we're designers, what can we learn from learning to code?
Well, I thought Morten's explanation of why you need a certain level of knowledge, but you don't have to. It was really fantastic, and obviously anybody doing something and they don't really understand why they've been asked to do it and why it's important is subconscious. Even if they're very willing to please, you're going to get some pushback. So communication and what Morten described there, knowing the structure, but not having to be expected to have the skill to optimize it to the most highest level. I thought it was a really great way of explaining it. But then on the other extreme, you get people like what Morten said, a designer's got a code. I don't think that at all. And trying to make somebody that's not really interested in coding and forcing them, you're not going to end up with a great person. But on the other hand, if they understand the process, you're going to get a much better outcome, aren't you, John?
Yeah, I think that's totally true. Last question I want to ask the panel before we fade to black here is, I want to ask everybody, if you're a designer, how do you go out and find like a good developer to work with? And if you're a developer, how do you find somebody that's compatible with you as a designer? Ask Nick, since you've already gone through this process.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was easier just because I was at the job before I was doing what I do now. I was working with Hunter. So we kind of just, we had the process there. We noticed that we worked really well together, and that was a really easy transition for us at that point. I mean, from a developer standpoint, it's really just aesthetics. I mean, I like the way, he's got a certain style that I really like. And that was an easy decision for me, at least. And for developers, I think that's a tougher question, because I don't know, it gets more complicated at that point. And like, I'm very nitpicky when it comes to code. So anytime I hire any developers to come work with us, like, I'm looking at their code and I'm like, nope, it's not good. Like, sorry, I can't do that. So like, I mean, most people aren't as nitpicky as I am, but I think from a designer perspective, you really, as long as they can, if like you said, if you have the design call where you talk about, all the effects on the actual visual that you've created, and if they can execute on that within, your given amount of time, then I think, that's good enough if that works for you.
Excellent. Kim, when it comes to hiring like a complementary person, like whether it's to a designer needing a developer, a developer needing a designer, does it come down to chemistry, or what sort of things should people be looking for?
Particularly if you're independent, I'd say, yeah, of course, chemistry is important. However, that really, I think, is where it keys in, that maybe you don't need to know every detail, but you at least need the high level understanding about what the other person does. So for example, if you're a designer and you just need a developer who's going to help you with, whatever your WordPress backend piece is, you at least need to have that high level knowledge to know not the levelers, that they didn't build a theme where every single item on the sidebar was an H1. So all of a sudden you've got 20 H1s, right? You need to at least know the what you're hiring for at that level, even if you don't know all the details. Same with a developer. You need to know just enough to talk to a designer to know that what they're going to design has a friendliness for accessibility, for example. So they're not going to put these weird, funky colors together that all of a sudden you blow up all your accessibility. So I think it just comes down to shared language there and understanding enough. And then, then you need the chemistry. That's the second piece.
So what I'm taking away is definitely like if that person that you're pulling in, they have to have kind of the shared like knowledge of what works on the web.
Mhm.
Morten, any tips for pulling in like a complementary person, designer or developer?
Expect to spend some time working on this. It's not easy. It's like finding a business partner, right? From my experience, what works best is try. Find someone whose work you like, or ask around to find someone whose work is appreciated or recommended. And then from there, see if it works. Try to do a small project together and be ready to run into challenges, and then assess, is this a challenge because we can't work together, or is this a communication problem, or or do we need to do things differently, and invest time in relationships. It's no different from working in a big company. Whenever you get a new coworker, you have to go through all these learning steps to figure out how it works. The only difference is if you're a freelancer or you're a small company, you have more freedom, but there's usually more at stake. So yeah, just take recommendations, look at people's work, have conversations with them, sit down before you start any project. Just sit down with them and say, okay, how do you think about these things? What are your values? How do you see the world? Is all this stuff going to work together? When do you get stressed out? How do you want things to be handled? Just find people who resonate with you. The other thing is, there are people in our industry who are incredibly good at their jobs. They are also in high demand, and everyone wants to work with them. We have, like, in the Vancouver area, there's one person who's excellent at e-commerce, and the first thing everyone does when there's an e-commerce project is go to him and say, hey, let's do this. And he's like, what, are you crazy? I have 1,000 other things that are happening, right? One of the things that can be beneficial, but it's a bit of a higher risk, is to, instead of going for the people who are well established and successful already, try to find up and coming or rising stars in the field. That might mean you have to help them grow. And helping freelancers grow may also mean once you've helped them grow to a certain level, walk away with your clients. So it's a risky endeavor, but it also may result in great things. And we work in open source. The whole philosophy of open source is to stand on top of other people's shoulders and then help other people up. And that's how you do it. You find someone who has great raw talent and you help them build a career out of it. And then maybe if it works well, you should just join and become a company together so that you don't have that risk of people running away with your clients.
That's very well said. And one of the things that I look at when you're talking about, say, like web agencies, if a person isn't a partner, I think everybody does leave after, 3 to 5 years, because they can't just stay stagnant in the same thing. The people do grow and evolve over time. And another great thing that you said that I want to key in on is when you're evaluating a person, find out like who they are and do they see the world in a similar way. And start with a small project. Small projects, or one that's not like, overly complicated, or, don't throw them in the deep water first. Find something that you can kind of evaluate just how they work together. That's a great way to start. And Jonathan, any thoughts on finding a complementary person, whether a designer or developer? How do you evaluate?
Not really. I think both you and Morten have really covered the basic things. It's not going to be easy, and you are going to be looking at quite a few people, aren't you? And like you said, the obvious thing is not to throw them in the deep end unless something's blown up and you've got no alternative. It's best to try out some small projects, isn't it, John?
I think that's the best way to start. And then, if you guys like have good chemistry and, the work is good, then you just continue on. And that's how you establish working relationships. With that, I think we're coming to the conclusion of this episode. So everybody, let us know where to find you, anything that you want to promote. And Nick, where do we find you?
Probably the best place is on Twitter. It's just Nick_Meager. You can also email me from my website, nickmeager.com. I also just created a startup, if you guys want to check that out. It's
cool.
inkroar.com. It's not launched yet. We're in the process of getting beta users, but it'll be launched probably within the next 3 to 4 weeks. So,
Okay, and how do you spell that?
Inkroar, INKROA.com.
Okay, cool. We'll put that in show notes.
Thank you.
Kim, how do we find you? Anything you want to promote?
You can find me on Twitter, Kim Shivler. You can find me at White Glove Web Training or howtobuildanonlinecourse.com. And pretty soon I'll be rolling out my umbrella site, kimshivler.com, to tie it all together.
Sweet. Morten, how do we find you? Anything you want to promote?
You usually find me on Twitter at Morten, because that's my name. That's MOR10. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I write stuff on LinkedIn Pulse and the LinkedIn Learning blog. And I have a website called morten.com. And of course, I have a ton of courses you should all watch at LinkedIn Learning and lynda.com. So
Excellent. Highly recommended. Jonathan, how do we get a hold of you? Anything that you want to promote?
Oh, it's quite easy, folks. I'm normally on Twitter every day, periodically, and that's at Jonathan Denwood. I think there is only one on Twitter. I have to check that, really. Or you could email me. I do answer my email, not straight away, but obviously if you've got a question, want some advice, I will reply if you email me. And just to finish off, just give a tweet out, or also go to their website, our sponsor, Liquid Web. They've been very generous over the past few months, and their support has been very beneficial to the podcast, hasn't it, John?
Definitely, yes. And remember, you can go to liquidweb.com/WordPress, use code WP-Tonic 33. You get 33% off your first 6 months. And they are definitely doing a lot of big things with managed WordPress hosting, so check that out. You can find me at my website, which is lockdowndesign.com. You can also follow me on Twitter, lockdown_. For the WP posse in effect, we want to say peace out and get your dose.
Right, I finished
nice
next.
tagline.
Very
I want to
nice.
point out we are still being recorded on Facebook, so if you want to swear, well, you can. So, Morten, I'm bonkers, aren't I? A benign dictatorship. Bonkers.
I love it.
I love it. I got slapped down, you bonkers. And I always got slapped down for old Chris Mayer, didn't he? He sorted me out, didn't he, John? He put me right, didn't he?
I was actually thinking of that, like before you even said it. I was kind of having a flashback to that conversation, but you know what though? but something that you said, Morten, really like resonated with me, and because it's really the 1% of the 1% of people that use WordPress that are making all the decisions. Yeah. Meanwhile, there's all these millions, hundreds of millions of people using it. They have no idea who Matt Mullenweg or anybody else is, for that matter. Mm-hmm. And they're just like, this is the platform that everybody says is cool. This is what I should use. That's what everybody says.
And the thing is, if you talk to people who use WordPress, you'll quickly realize that outside of the bubble we're in, WordPress is considered software. Professional software that's developed by a company. And the majority of people think that WordPress is developed by Automatic, an actual company that earns money, right? And when things happen in WordPress, and you see this all the time, right? Anytime there's some sort of controversial change, there's always a ton of people who are like, oh, Automatic is blah, 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 right? It's simply because it's weird. People are not used to the idea of open source. They're used to relating everything to a real company. And because of that, they expect things to work as they expect. Like it's just a very, we have a bit of a kind of casual attitude to the reality of how powerful WordPress really is and how many people really use it and how much of an impact the design change has. That's not to say the people who make those decisions, they're very careful about making the decisions. It's more the overall philosophy that stands behind how those decisions are made is still very much rooted in this is a small project that the developers who develop it are using, and it's really for, like, we still haven't gotten beyond that. We're actually not developing WordPress for us, we're developing for everyone else. And it's just it's complicated because it requires a change in attitude towards the project, and it actually requires us to distance ourselves from the project and say we're not building this for us anymore, which is a big and hard pill to swallow for most people, I think.
I think a lot of it has to do with, and I think a lot of it might have to do with the WordPress bubble too, it is kind of like a big deal if you're like a contributor, or you're a person making decisions, or but there's a lot of responsibility, and perhaps there should be more layers of oversight or management, because like you said, it's not B2 and we're not pushing it out to a couple hundred people anymore. It's, we're actually powering like hundreds of millions of sites, and I don't think that we like actually get that. So I don't know.
Life is complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Life comes at you fast.
It's just the way it is.
It's complicated.
All right, I gotta run.
Okay, thanks,
Morten.
Thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye, Nick.
Good to see you.
Bye. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Thank you, Nick.
Go.
Well, I think too, Morten, along with what you were saying from what he was saying from the end user perspective, guys, too, again, who I deal with, they don't really even understand not just the WordPress, but then if you add something else that's a third-party plugin or another whatever theme you choose, that's not just one company, right? They're still thinking of that as the same way if they went and bought it from Microsoft or Apple.
Yeah,
But
well,
it's not.
I think that's a great point you're making there, Kim, and it was linked to last week's roundtable where we had Bridget, and you pointed that out when you were discussing things with Bridget, is that to outside the bubble, it's all WordPress. They don't even. I think even a lot of people don't realise that a commercial theme comes from a separate company, that these plugins come from all individual people.
Yep. So like
it doesn't even enter their mind. It's not even in their psyche, is it, Kim?
It's not. Absolutely.
It's all just WordPress, and if one bit is a crummy experience, they just blame WordPress for it, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's been an ongoing discussion. That commercial plugins and commercial themes should be rated somehow by the community, and those that follow the best practice should get some recognition from the community that they are trusted partners, even though they're commercial. But that hasn't got anywhere, has it?
No. Well, and even with that, look at what's going on with WooCommerce that we didn't get to today.
Oh, that's
right.
True, yeah.
So even quote trusted partners, you can have some issues sometimes, and it's. I think. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. You guys tell me if you can think of another. I cannot think of another open source project in my life that I can remember that became this embraced and used in a completely non-technical people, just across the board in business.
I can't think of one.
Not really. Obviously there's some, no, not really. Well,
not by non-technical people. By technical people, yes, but not by like just casual people.
Yeah, but couldn't you say like Word or the Office suite is utilized by a load, or
it's proprietary?
It's proprietary, though.
Yeah, open source. Yeah.
I mean, if you want to count the knockoff on Microsoft Office, the OS Office or Open Office, which is technically open source, and it's been moved around from Java to, Sun Microsystems started it, and I think Oracle owns it now. But it was a knockoff of proprietary software.
Yeah.
Which is the Microsoft suite.
No, you are right. It's open source. I wasn't thinking straight there. It is the biggest open source project that is utilized by millions of people out there, isn't it?
I think so. Like that was one of the comments in that WooCommerce article was like, if you're not using Git and et cetera, you're an idiot. Like, and someone else answered like, there's a lot of people using WooCommerce that are not, they don't even know what Git is.
They wouldn't even have any idea.
The bubble is very thick. I mean, like
It is. It's the
really-
dome.
it really,
Remember that
really-
movie, The Dome?
yeah.
It actually, I think, it's great in some ways. You buddy, you have this community. But in some ways, I think me and John try and also bring in people outside the community into the podcast.
It's enlightening.
And also we try and keep we have other things that we're doing, so we're not totally engrossed in just WordPress.
I think WordPress, like in a lot of ways, like the longer that I've been in it, like the more it is kind of, and I understand like the people who are kind of like these stars, like the stars of WordPress. It's like, okay, that's cool. Outside of WordPress, very few of those people are known. And I understand that it's like in any, you could say that about Drupal, or you could say that about Joomla. I don't know any of those people. I have no idea who they are. But I bet you inside those communities, they're like super well known. But it's a gamble of can you be inside this ecosystem and get to the top? But and the same thing, like and that's what I want to do is not, too, is bringing these other people, like Jonathan Courtney. And it's like so eye-opening. This guy does work for global brands like eBay, like the United Nations and stuff. And the way that they do things is so vastly different than maybe the way things are done like here.
Well, it was funny, wasn't it, when Morten's talking about persona development? And
that's traditional. But they don't even do that in WordPress, though. Not to my knowledge. I don't know.
I don't know. Well, we're going to switch us off on the recording now, folks, and join us next week. It's every Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time.
Let's give it what is coming up next week? Let me take a look here. Really quick.
We should plug that before we go, folks.
Yeah, let's plug it. Let me see what is coming up. Okay, so next week we're talking event management plugins. Ought to be a good.
Woohoo!
Yeah.
Woohoo!
We haven't done that one. We have never done this subject ever.
It's funny. I just had to research one for a client, so I'll be interested to hear what everybody else has to come up with. Yeah, because a lot of them have some real SEO issues, which is why I had to do the research. So I'm very excited about it. Like a lot of them will create multiple meta information all the same.
Oh,
call that duplicate content. So, good. I'll be back. I'm leaving for New York on Sunday, but I'll be back for Friday.
Oh, that's great. And hopefully Lee Jackson will join us because he actually produces product in that area, doesn't he, John?
Yeah, he has like like besides Angled Crown, he has another gig where he does sites for like event planning and events and stuff like that.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah, we got to get him on. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So I'm going to end this recording and join us next Friday at 9 a.m., folks, for another dose of WP Tonic. Bye.